It's been more than 3 years since the disastrous Citizens United ruling was handed down by the U.S. Supreme Court, and the effects that unrestricted corporate money have had on our elected politicians has been terrible for our democracy. But the branch of government that often gets overlooked when it comes to following the corporate money trail is the judiciary, and the effects of corporate money are just as apparent in the judiciary as they are in the other branches of our government. And I have attorney Mike Berg with me now to talk about that. Mike, thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for being here. It's a very important issue.
It is. And, you know, as I just said, I think a lot of people often overlook the judiciary when it comes to thinking about government in general. You know, we always focus on Congress or the Senate or the president, but we forget that we have this third branch of government as just as powerful as the other two. And they're not paying attention to any of the money that's flowing into these judicial elections. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And the problem is bigger than people really know. As you know, the judiciary should be independent. In about half the states, justices of the Supreme Court as well as judges are elected. And they have to go out and raise large sums of money. Joanna Shepard, professor at Emory University, did a study on this. And really the results are predictable but amazing. One of the things she found was that it's cross-party lines. People may think that it's just Republicans, not Republicans and Democrats, but in fact, her study showed that it is more likely the money that business and corporations give to Democratic candidates and justices affects them even more than those pro-business Republican justices in terms of buying their votes. In essence, justice and justices are being bought.
Exactly. And you brought up a great point from the Shepard study, is that Republicans are typically going to vote or rule in favor of corporations majority of the time. I mean, the studies show that. But it's the Democrats, you know, the people we want to think are going to be impartial, that are going to protect consumers, they are more easily swayed by this corporate money than anyone else. And again, Citizens United has exacerbated this problem tremendously. And it actually, I believe it began back in the good old days when they started pushing tort reform, because the trial lawyers associations across the country said, you know, we can't have this. So they started putting money behind justices across the country in elections. But once corporations saw that, they said, well, we can outdo you. And they did. They are now putting in millions upon millions of dollars to purchase these justices so that the trial lawyers, the people out there defending consumers, protecting consumers, don't have a chance in court. Is that correct?
It really is. And one of the things I like to say is this is not necessarily, I like to spin it, which is this is not necessarily just pro-business. It is anti-consumer, anti-the public, anti-the poor person on the street. That what's going on is it's being bought and paid for. One of the interesting things about Citizens United is that since that went into effect, we've seen tremendous change in the kind of results we're seeing from Supreme Courts. As we already know, those justices that made the decision in Citizens United, when the study was done as to those that were most pro-business in the history of the Supreme Court, 5 of the justices presently sitting on the Supreme Court are within the top 10 in terms of being slanted and biased toward the large corporations.
Exactly. And I believe that same study said that we have the most pro-business, anti-consumer U.S. Supreme Court than we've had in the last 75 years. You know, since World War II, we're dealing with a Supreme Court that, you know, a majority of the time is going to go in favor of big business. And there are numerous studies out there that confirm this. This is not speculation or hyperbole. We know this. There is hard evidence. Just go back and look at the rulings, and it's there. Majority of the time, the business is going to win. And so, you know, I kind of want to get back into this issue of the money in the lower courts. You know, a couple years ago, I did a piece for the Trial Lawyer magazine, a big expose on the money flowing into judicial elections. And this was actually before Citizens United took place. And so for the 10-year period between 2000 and 2010, right before the ruling went into effect, the business groups, the largest of which the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, put $200 million into judicial elections all across the country. And you have to ask yourself, why do these people want certain judges elected? Well, the answer is obvious, isn't it?
Yeah, they want those people elected because they're nothing more than doing the handiwork of the corporations, denying access to the courts through making people go to arbitration, denying access to the courts in terms of throwing out cases that are legitimate. I must tell you, what's interesting today is that we as lawyers, which we used to rely on, the rule of law. Well, the rule of law, unfortunately, because of all the money in the judiciary, has changed. Now the question is, who is our judge and who are the justices who are going to decide it? Because they've made up their mind that regardless of what really the rule of law is, they're going to find in favor of the giant corporations. It's very sad and scary.
And it's not only the buying of judges, it's the whole buying of justice. Because they're also putting money into these efforts to push tort reform, which is an absolute disaster for consumers. I mean, we've done the math. If you have a healthy person in their mid-20s who goes into the doctor and they amputate the wrong leg, and suppose it's in Texas where you have medical malpractice caps where tort reform is going into place. If they live their entire rest of their life missing one leg because of a doctor error, what would the $250,000 cap would amount to? I think it's about between $4 and $5 per day for the rest of their life. That's a cup of coffee every day because the doctor cut off your wrong leg because of these corporate pushes for things like tort reform. And now, even more than tort reform, they're pushing this mandatory arbitration. What is that? What does that mean for consumers?
Well, I'll tell you, first let me tell you, your point you made about the Med-Mal is really a good one, Farron, because what people don't understand, I don't care, you're Democrat, Republican, that person who they cut off the wrong leg, they end up on the tax rolls. We, the taxpayers, pay for them, except for the person or the corporation that damaged that person, who should be held responsible and accountable. With regard to arbitration, what happens there, you don't get to have a jury of your peers, your neighbors, which is one of the fundamental rights in this country. They get to appoint an arbitrator, many times which is on a panel which has already been selected, so it's pro-business. You then have to go to that arbitrator. The cost is enormous. You have to pay that arbitrator, and that arbitrator, based on the recent Supreme Court ruling, has the final say with very little chance of appeal. So really, you really have what could be a rigged system by forcing someone to go to arbitration. And that's where we're headed. That's where we're going down that road. That's what the Supreme Court has said, and that's what big business wants. They want a rigged system.
Right, and a lot of these big businesses, cell phone companies, I know, are terrible with this. People sign these contracts, constantly that they don't read. And, you can't blame them. Sometimes it's 30, 40 pages, and the average consumer out there walking in to buy a new cell phone plan doesn't necessarily have time to do that. But what they don't realize is when they're signing at the end of that contract, they are agreeing to this mandatory binding arbitration deal. It happens, if you go buy a car, you buy a cell phone, any kind of large appliances. If
banks,
you have a problem
banks right now are... They're putting arbitration clauses. And what people have to understand, let's use a phone company. Let's assume they're rounding up and they're stealing $1 or 50 cents from 100 million people who have contracts with them. So they're taking $100 million from those people. You know what the Supreme Court has told the public? You know what? You can go to arbitration and get your 50 cents. You can no longer be part of a class action, and you can't sue as a group. You must go to arbitration. Well, no lawyer and no consumer is going to do that. In essence, they've given these companies a license to steal.
Right. And in the situations, when you have justices that can't be bought and paid for because they're not elected, the corporations are out there, and the super PACs, the Koch brothers, Karl Rove, they're still doing this. It's just we don't know what's happening because they're putting money into groups. There's a great new book out by Michael Avery and Danielle McLaughlin called The Federalist Society, how conservatives took the law back from liberals. And it explains how this conservative group called the Federalist Society, it's been around for decades, they actually meet with governors, they meet with newly elected presidents or presidential candidates, and they sit down and they basically tell them who they can pick as judges, who should be good for this court, who's good for this court, who's good for the Supreme Court, and they lay this out for them, and it's all based on who's going to be pro-business, who's going to be anti-consumer, who's going to protect the people like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce who are paying our money. And we've seen it clearly with the current U.S. Supreme Court. In the last session, I believe that 100% of the U.S. Chamber cases that came before the court were ruled in favor of the U.S. Chamber. And in this session, 6 out of 7 went in favor of the Chamber.
Yeah, it's really a sad commentary on our democracy, and the public has to be aware of it. And if they're not, and that's what's great about a show like this, to make them aware so they can really stand up and say to their congressmen, their elected officials, and saying, look, we shouldn't have elected judges, we shouldn't have elected justices, and we need to fight and stand up and fight this. As you know, in a simple state election of a justice, the chamber and the big corporate entities are they put up as much as 10 or 12 or $20 million to get that justice elected. That's really a destruction of the basis of our society and our democracy.
Exactly, and as the Shepard study that we discussed earlier pointed out, a 1% donation, meaning if a corporation gives a judge 1% of the total money that they raise, they're getting a 46.5% probability of receiving a favorable ruling if they ever go up against that judge. And that is what our democracy has become today. Mike Berg, thank you so much for joining me today. Thank you so much for following this topic for us.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Mike Berg is the past president of the National Trial Lawyers Association. And when we come back, investigative journalist Brad Friedman is going to join us to talk about the abuse of privilege taking place with private companies that the U.S. government has contracted. So stay tuned. We'll be right back with more Ring of Fire.
Issue of valuing ecosystem services. Now, I think WWF is